We know that your responses to heat changes if you live and exercise in hot conditions. But what about in the cold? Does your body and physiology change the more time that you spend in the cold? In today's episode, we'll take a look at the breath-hold divers of Korea and Japan, a unique occupation and group that, in some cases, have been working in cold water for 50 years or more. The question of how much is nature and how much is nurture is a timeless question, and it applies to why some people seem to thrive in environmental extremes like high-altitude mountaineering. In the same vein, why is it that some people seem so suited to working in the cold? Is it because they have a natural physiological advantage? Or is it because they adapt over time to the demands of the job? Some of the ways in which adaptation may occur include reducing heat loss by increasing the amount of fat as insulation or else shutting down blood flow to the skin. Another way is to increase the amount of heat production by increasing the amount of shivering and non-shivering metabolism. Finally, the brain may simply adjust by tolerating a lower body temperature before we start shivering. The breath-hold divers of Korea and Japan, the Haenyeo and Ama respectively, are a fascinating study in a lifetime of physiological adaptation. In Korea, this largely female job was once very prevalent, but has dropped in number from about 14,000 in 1970 to just 4,000 in 2015. There have been very few young people taking up this job, so most of the remaining divers are in their 60s and 70s and have been doing this for over 50 years. This makes for a natural, longitudinal study tracking one large group over decades. One really interesting change in technology is that cotton bathing suits were used throughout history, but the switch to the much more insulative neoprene wetsuits happened in the 1980s, during the current diver's career. In the 1960s, when cotton swimsuits were still dominant, Professor S.K. Hong performed a series of studies to compare the cold responses of Korean Haenyeo divers with non-diving women. The Haenyeo did not have more fat and insulation. However, they had a greater reduction of blood flow to their skin, making their existing fat tissue more effective at trapping heat and increasing their functional insulation. In the winter, the Haenyeo also had a strong increase in resting metabolic rate and heat production than in summer months that was not seen in non-divers, while their core temperature at which shivering began was also lower than non-divers. Finally, hand and finger temperatures in the Haenyeo were also lower than non-divers. This was all done before wetsuits became dominant. What happened when the Haenyeo had access to wetsuits and thus more insulation? Early studies by Hong suggest that the Haenyeo lost most of these cold adaptations once wetsuits became dominant, and that their cold responses became nearly identical to non-divers. This would suggest that nurture, or environmental stimulus, plays a huge role in changes to the body. It may be that you weren't necessarily born for a certain job. However, there's a huge gap in knowledge, as research with the Haenyeo largely went into hibernation for several decades. Luckily, Professor Ju-Young Lee has taken up the torch over the past decade to research this group before the current divers retire and the occupation possibly becomes extinct. Her initial work comparing them with non-diving older Korean women suggests that some long-term cold adaptations may remain, such as a decrease in skin blood flow to reduce heat loss and a lesser reliance on heat production. The world of environmental physiology is indebted to the Haenyeo for giving us insight into how the body responds to a lifetime of cold work. I'm Professor Stephen Chung, and I run the Environmental Ergonomics Lab in the Department of Kinesiology at Brock University. We post new episodes on different topics in environmental physiology every Wednesday. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.